The Gunk was added to Game Pass the same day it was released, developed by Image & Form and published by Thunderful Publishing. We'd heard some good sentiment around this game online. You know what they say though, don't believe everything you read on the internet. We decided to try out the Gunk ourselves and find out if it is worth your time. The Gunk starts off very strong with its core gameplay. Hoovering up the Gunk is satisfying, it feels and sounds good. The gameplay has a solid foundation, but unfortunately it doesn't do nearly enough with that foundation. The gameplay cycle here is clean up Gunk, scan objects, harvest materials, explore the area, upgrade, rinse and repeat. None of these elements are bad on their own, but there is no real expansion of ideas here. The Gunk goes from stationary to moving, and that is it. Areas have small puzzles within, but the puzzles never change. There are a lot of good ideas buried in here, but there was no desire to further any of the ideas present. There is also some light combat in the game, but it doesn't feel integrated into the experience. The enemies simply weren't fun to fight. You can hoover enemies up or blast them, but there is no building upon the idea. There's no upgrades for your weapon aside from turning it from stun to lethal. An area of effect upgrade or something to add a bit more flair to your blaster would have gone a long way. The Gunk also contains platforming sections, and I will say the movement feels good. You can move around the world at a decent pace and the environments are fun to explore when you aren't clipping on rough terrain. The issue I had here is that you can only platform on predetermined sections of the environment. This has two adverse effects on gameplay. First, it pulls me out of the world. Why can I only jump up this specific area of Chest High Cliff? Secondly, it makes later combat sections a pain. Trying to platform with multiple aimbot plants attacking you whilst Gunk is everywhere just wasn't fun. There were also several instances where the Gunk just took over my screen, and I could not see at all. This happened within certain scripted segments. My final gripe is really specific, but worth mentioning. There is no flashlight toggle, and the end of the game can get really dark. Having to rely on when the game decided I would need a flashlight was frustrating when any one of the D-pad buttons could have been relegated to letting me toggle the flashlight. This isn't all bad though, the game does have some strengths. UI design is pretty good, it was very easy for me to see and understand how everything works, and upgrade descriptions include tutorials to streamline the experience. Shortcuts feed back into the main path wonderfully, I never had to backtrack to get out of a secret path I found. Finally, the Gunk arm is very intuitive to control. I never had any issues with getting the thing angled how I needed it. Simply hold down the right trigger to suck in the direction you're moving, or hold down the left trigger to aim precisely. Overall, I think there are some solid ideas present here, but nothing is built upon, and it honestly feels like a glorified tech demo. I am being completely honest with you when I say that I was bored of the gameplay 30 minutes in, and I kept waiting for it to get better, only to be met with disappointment. The Gunk starts out rough with a 2 out of 5 for gameplay. Back in Positivity Land, can we talk about how gorgeous this game is? Environments are wonderfully varied and serve gameplay in a great way. The world design is the highlight here. Everything from the painted skies to the ruins in the foliage is simply gorgeous, but the Gunk goes a little further and actually ties art direction to gameplay in a decent way. Firstly, let's talk about that titular Gunk. It exists in direct comparison to the environment of the world. The Gunk is this evil looking red and black blob. The area it exists in has no saturation, it is simply black and white, with a red outline letting you know where the area affected is. When you clear the Gunk, you get this awesome little bubble effect and the world comes alive around you. It just looks and feels great, and it makes the gameplay feel more satisfying, which it certainly needs to. Each chapter has a different setting, and these are all varied, with different scales, elevations, and themes. The world feels like a living place, and I have to commend the developers behind its design. Animations are satisfying, from hoovering up Gunk and materials to the cool beam your blaster shoots. As said in the gameplay section, UI is well designed and clear. It has a nice sci-fi theme and isn't needlessly convoluted. The music is also well composed, although it felt as though each area only had one track. These areas aren't massively long, but you'll get sick of even your favourite song if you have to listen to it for half an hour on repeat. All of the time and effort was clearly put into the world, because it looks fabulous, whereas the characters look like they were made in dreams. Characters are stiffly animated and don't have any defining design choices. The characters weren't designed with character in mind. What I mean by this is if you look at the characters, their design tells you nothing about them. Rani just looks like your standard sci-fi explorer, and Beck looks pulled from an indie movie. Dialogue is not lip-synced with the models and everything just feels cheap. Compared to the amazing world design, the character design is simply lacking, and I struggle to believe that such a gap exists. The final issue I have with the art direction here is that some sick monster decided to put a massive amount of motion blur on the screen when you move the camera, and there is no option to turn it off. This won't affect the score here as it is more of a specs issue, but it is absolutely worth mentioning as it takes a beautiful world and turns it to sludge. This review is sounding a lot more negative than it is in this segment. The only major issue here is character design. The world design is so top-notch, it's hard to believe it is a part of the same package. It is so good that we're giving the game a 4 out of 5 for art direction. It is really solid here. The narrative here is poor. Where do I even begin? Fundamentally, the game treats the player like an idiot when it comes to narrative. Nothing is left to interpretation. Everything is told to you. My mind would try to wonder what had happened in this world before the characters started spouting the intended take 5 seconds later. There was no break from this throughout the entire game. Games as a medium are special because they let you experience a story. This story is just told to you. It feels like a radio play that you are just an audience member to. We also called Firewatch a radio play narrative, but it works in that game because you are a part of that play. You have to contribute to the conversation with your dialogue choices. It also had the benefit of great voice acting, whereas the performances here feel so stiff and lifeless. That is when you can hear the performances. As you can see from our gameplay, we played the game without subtitles. This is so that we can get better looking footage. If you play the game yourself, keep the subtitles on for your own benefit. Your character's voice is perfectly legible throughout the whole game, but Beck's radio chatter is incomprehensible when mixed in with the sound of gameplay. The cherry on top of all of this is that the narrative just isn't unique in any way. Nothing is earned, everything is told, and heaven forbid you get subverted. There was nothing here to make me care about the characters, and it felt like conflict happened because that was what was written in the script. I will be very surprised if I play a game with a narrative this cookie cutter again this year, and I'm giving the Gunk the minimum score of 1 out of 5 for its poor narrative offerings. The good news here is that the major negative part of the review is over. Objectively, this game works for the most part and has some great settings. The Gunk is a complete experience, even if complete is a strong word. Once you finish the campaign, you are done and free to move on with your life. I only ran into a few bugs in my playthrough. The first bug I encountered was when a cutscene played around 30 seconds too late. I'm not sure what caused this, but it wasn't obtrusive and didn't impede on my experience. The second bug I encountered was where a throwable object just didn't throw. Again, it wasn't obtrusive, but we do like to be thorough. As discussed in the gameplay segment of this review, there were a few instances where the Gunk covered my camera and left me unable to see what was happening on screen. This did impede on my gameplay. Let's talk settings. You aren't getting any save slots here, but autosave is generous and makes getting back to where you were a breeze. Settings are divided up into 5 tabs. Game lets you toggle auto camera, aim mode, aim assist, and invert your camera in both directions. There are also sliders for sensitivity and controller vibration. User interface lets you toggle subtitles and tweak their size. There are no subtitle settings, but the default subtitles are really clear and make even the most garbled radio speak understandable. There is also a toggle for time played here, which is great quality of life for speedrunners. Finally, there is a brightness slider. Sound is divided up into 4 sliders: master, sounds, dialogue, and music. Controls are completely remappable. The base controls are already solid, but having the option to tweak everything to your preference is a great quality of life feature. There are language options for English, French, Italian, Dutch, and Spanish. The only omission here is no motion blur toggle. Motion blur is the first thing I turn off in games, and I did not enjoy having to play through a game with so much. Despite my gripes with it, the package here is complete, and there are some solid quality of life features in the settings. For these reasons, the Gunk gets a 4 out of 5 for specs. The Gunk took us 3 hours, 29 minutes and 28 seconds to complete. This was a full playthrough. We weren't the biggest fans of the gameplay, but we have to admit that the game overall does not overstay its welcome. No chapter in the game is longer than an hour in length, and this lends the game to some solid episodic game sessions. If you only have an hour free every night to game, you can fit this one in. There was no backtracking in the game. I never had to spend time coming back out of a secret path I found. It just looped back into the main path. This is a great quality of life feature for those looking to 100% the game. The game is fairly friendly on your hard drive too, at a 9.7GB install. There are really no complaints here. The game does everything right by our commitment scale, and thus gets a perfect 5 out of 5. The Gunk is worth your time if you want a romp through a gorgeous world. Gameplay feels good but gets repetitive early on. I cannot recommend this game for its narrative at all. I get the feeling that this game could have been great had it had more time in the oven, but alas, we have to review the final product we played. There are plenty of fantastic short games out there, and unfortunately, the Gunk is not one of them.